Good morning, friends. Today is our first conversation with a non-historian. And so hopefully that's just going to be completely wonderful. If it's not, then we're going to blame Professor Tootle for inviting a non-historian to our team. I think this has the potential for being one of the most important topics that we've had because people just really don't understand our system of governance. And at a time when so many people say stupid stuff on the interweb, occasionally me as well on Facebook, we're going to have a revolution over this. Well, before you say that, maybe we should at least find out what our current system's about. So today's conversation is how are laws made, historically and currently? And we have two subject matter experts. I have a little bit of transference over both since I worked at the state capitol for 3 sessions as an intern. Early on in my career, I have a political science degree and a law degree. But we have a true expert with us, Bart Miller, who wrote the laws in Colorado for, I don't know, 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years. I don't know how old you are, Bart, but a long time. But before we go to our subject matter expert, Bart, I think it's important to ask a sense of history from our historian. How are laws made historically? So Professor Tootle, a line or two on your background, but then can you also, with my political science degree, is it the Code of Hammurabi? I'm not even sure I said that right. It's been 30 or 40 years since is it the Republic of Rome or is it Greece? Do we need to go back to New England town hall meetings, or maybe it's the Magna Carta or House of Lords in England? Historically, how were laws made to get us up into the United States? And then we can continue. So Professor Tootle, background and then history.
How long do you want my answer to be?
Just 3 minutes. Yeah, I want you to take the entire written history of the human race into 3 minutes.
Sorry, Stephen Tootle, history professor at College of Boys. I think that there are these moments that are important in human development. One is the first big one is the development of written language. Because what that meant is you could have something that was objective, that was agreed upon, that traveled over distance and time. And so the first written language was really to put a seal on a bag of grain. And what that seal was really there to communicate is that at this date and at this time, this much grain was put in this bag, and I, this person, am saying this grain, this is in this bag. The next, so you skip forward a few thousand years, then what you have is the development of written language and then the development of written law. And even if those laws favor a particular ruling class, they don't have to even necessarily necessitate what we would even consider equality or rights or anything like that. But just having the laws written down meant that there is at least a principle introduced into your public life that that a person can appeal to and say that there is a larger objective truth that is either being met or not being met. And the next,
what kind of era are we in, though, Professor? When you say the written law, and is that in Western civilization, or do other cultures have the same thing happening?
I mean, it develops. It's one of those things that develops differently in different cultures. Almost every culture develops it in a similar stage, But there are examples. I always throw out, like in the development of like quipu, which is this tied knot. That if you come up with something other than written language, it does turn out that human beings can to devise other systems that will do the same thing. That doesn't necessarily have to be written language, and then you don't have the same language development. But I think instead of saying it's not something that is exclusive to the Western tradition, it's just seems to be a thing that is necessary once you begin having a complex civilization, because you need to be able to trust information that's coming from someone you don't know.
But is this handwritten, or did we have to wait until Gutenberg? What era are we in when we start to get reliability of laws?
reliability of laws.
I know.
Well, like I said, instead of thinking about it as being like on a fixed timeline in human history, I think of it as being until 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Every civilization on Earth is developing at different rates, and they're out of the Eastern Hemisphere is out of contact with the Western Hemisphere, and the Afro-Eurasian landmass is kind of one civilization, but you have stuff going on in Asia that's really unrelated to Britain, and you have stuff that's going on in Australia and all of the Americas. So, dates, I think it's more important maybe to establish what the principles are for how humans relate to written law. But in terms of what, once we get into the era where the world is in communication with itself, probably the next big leap forward is what happens in England, where I would say the biggest civilizational change for the world happens when, because in most places for all time, it went God, King, Law. And for the first time, you have a place that goes God, Law, King. and that changeover that happens in England really is what sets the stage for everything that happens in Western civilization and the existence of the United States. And it's impossible to imagine the creation of the United States outside of that legal tradition.
What was the tipping point? What was the key that made that change between God, Law, King, and God?
The Protestant Reformation, because you still have to have some sort of legitimacy of the law, but once you have this back and forth between nobles and the king, where they're competing for power and authority with the church, so you have to have a wealthy class, you have to have a religion, and you have to have a king competing with one another, but agreeing that what's the best for all people concerned, even though nobody really likes it, because everyone wants to just be God and proclaim things. The nobility wanted it, the church wanted it, and the king wanted it, but the
peasants wanted it, or no, they weren't even in the thing until a modern era.
They don't have any ability to this is still a society ruled by violence, so they don't command any large-scale violence that the other two groups would be afraid of.
Until the 20th century?
Well, no, there are peasant uprisings, but you kind of have to have the Protestant Reformation before you have large groups of peasants that will rise up and unify in something that is in opposition to a power structure. But the other thing,
the 18th century.
More like I'm trying to remember when the first peasant uprisings took place in Europe. What really has to happen is the other thing that has to happen is you have to feel somewhat secure within your own borders, to where you're fearing the local authority more than you're fearing outside invasion for a few years. So you also have to get past all of the, you have to not be living close to where the Muslim raiders are. You have to not be under attack from Goths or Visigoths or Huns or you name it. So let's say the 14 to 1500s is when you start getting peasants who are living in an area relatively stable enough, have an outside belief system where they can band together and commit acts of widespread violence together. But basically this is all prehistory to the United States.
So, Professor, I didn't know we'd go on this angle, but it's been a recurring theme. You're saying that it's really not possible to have law that we think of as law unless that violence is a little bit more distance.
Yes.
It's violence within each other rather than an outside, because if some outside entity is coming, we throw all the law out and we want to just survive, and we go to the king or the god or whatever, the autocrat, whoever is going to protect our lives and our families.
Yeah. No one cares what's on a piece of paper if you're under the direct threat of violence.
Wow. So it's just Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe you think it of some other way, but it's really simplicity of human nature.
I mean, yeah, I just think that, I don't know enough about Maslow or anything else.
Yeah, I know. You're a historian, not a sociologist. I get it. Okay, so Professor, I'm going to interrupt you now. Remember your whole train of thought, because we're going to merge these two.
Okay.
So Bart, you are an attorney at law. When we first met, I was an intern at the Capitol back in 1990. And working for State Representative Pat Grant or Martha Cruz, I'm not sure where. Pat Grant did welfare reform in Colorado, and I was his intern. And I think you wrote the welfare law for Pat Grant. I'm not sure of that. But anyway, don't get into great detail on that. But talk to me from history of Professor Tootle to now. When I was a young man, obviously I thought maybe I'd run for the legislature. And so I would go down to the Colorado State Capitol and I would write the law out and give it to you, right? And all of a sudden it would be implemented. Talk to us a little bit about the state of how laws are written in this century in Colorado as an example. Talk to us about your background and how laws are really written, and then we're going to merge history and current events. Bart Miller, welcome.
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Actually, I was with the Colorado legislature from 1985 until 2016. So that gives you an idea of kind of how long I was there and what I was doing. And actually what I worked, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but what I worked most closely with then Representative Pat Grant on, and he was I would say he was a powerful member of the Republican Party when they had the majority in the Colorado House of Representatives. And he was also a member of a fairly prominent family in Colorado that mountains are named after and various other things.
His uncle was the first Democratic governor of Colorado. Yeah,
rather ironically. But at any rate, the thing I worked most closely on with him it was workers' compensation reform, which was a really big deal back in the 1980s here in Colorado in the early 1990s. But to answer your question, my job when I was with the legislature was to take ideas. That's essentially how laws start out, ideas for policies, and turn them into something that the legislators themselves and various outside interest groups could debate and decide if they wanted what I had written to actually be implemented as law and pass it. And that's basically what I was doing. I was taking policy and turning it into law that either citizens would have to obey and follow, or state officials would have to implement. That's
okay. Now
really what I was doing.
You've never been elected to office. Actually, you have, but professionally, you've never been elected to office.
Correct.
So you're a hired gun. You're an attorney who represents who?
I viewed technically, I represented the Colorado General Assembly, the state legislature here.
All 100 of them, or the majority at the time?
All 100, which was
so
a rather
represent
interesting
an institution.
Thing. Exactly.
On behalf of taxpayers or
Absolutely.
Voters. Okay.
Yep, on behalf
and how
of
much
taxpayers.
of your own opinion did you put into your law writing? Are you God? Are you the king? Are you the noble esquire? Or no, you actually just tried to take their intent? And I'm not asking an ethics question. I'm just asking, how does it work? Who writes laws? Is it you?
For the most part, people like me. Way back at the beginning of our country, I believe people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and probably even John Quincy Adams, and people like that probably did write their own laws that they were proposing. And the professor can tell us, I think, it's
Yep.
pretty obvious the Declaration of Independence was written by Jefferson, I believe, and all of that.
I'm going to interrupt you now,
Okay,
Bart.
go ahead.
Let's go back to history for a second. Professor Tootle, do you agree with Bart's statement that when we were a younger country and there was only a couple million of us and these young idealists, the founders of our country and then the framers of our Constitution, did they actually write the laws themselves, or was there a professional class of citizens like Bart back then? Will you give us a little bit of sense of history?
Our founding fathers were that professional class of citizens. So I think it's more analogous to saying that the founding fathers were people like Bart. Think of them that way. I mean, that's what Thomas Jefferson was.
They, with their own hand, had an idea and started to write the words down of how it would make sense to form a country, or first have a revolution and then form a country. The Declaration of their own. There wasn't a class that they went to.
No, and I mean, typically the process for most of that stuff would be that one person would do the drafting, and the other thing is they're part of the British legal tradition anyway. They're already legislators. They're already familiar with how to do this stuff because they had all done them as parts of their colonial assembly. So once the colonial assemblies turn into states, that doesn't really change. The processes sort of carry over from the British tradition. So what would typically happen is one person would do the primary drafting, and it would be done. And then you would report it back to a small committee that would then report it to the larger body, and it would be modified further. And that's why we have such extensive notes on, that's why I can speak with authority on what the first draft of the Second Amendment meant and how it applied to the states and what they were thinking, because we have all of these things as part of the broader legal tradition.
Excellent. So Bart, going back to you, from your experience over 40 years, did I get that right? How long were you down at the state legislature?
Just 32.
Okay, 32 years. Was there a time before term limits in Colorado that there was the citizen advocate, the rancher, the farmer, the rich family, the lawyer, legislator, citizen legislator, where they actually drafted some of the law or much of it and then came to you for, a double check and an opinion, or right from the get-go? I mean, now we have term limits and these legislators come and go, and they're not these old rich people in Colorado. They're everybody. They're housewives, they're students, they're the whole mixed bag of humanity. Did you see a change over the last 30 years, or has it always been the same in 30 years?
I think, to be honest, largely it was the same.
Okay.
When I first started there in the mid 1980s, there were legislators who had been there long enough that they would, in a sense, write their own laws. They wouldn't write the entire law. They'd come to me and say, I want a law doing this, and I'd give them what I wrote. And then they'd come back to me and say, well, I'd like it better if we could make this sentence read this way or this paragraph read that way. And my job was to do what they wanted. I was really a servant. I was not a policymaker. And that's the distinction that I had to constantly make in my mind as to what I was doing. And yeah, I have personal views of things, but my personal views didn't really affect what I was doing because I had a role to play as their staff person, as their attorney, to make sure that what was happening is what they wanted to happen, because they're the elected official.
So Bart, without naming any names, clearly, because that's just not my style for one, but it doesn't help the conversation. Is it not true in general? Think of another state, because I don't want anyone to come back on you. Is it possible that there are some or even many legislators that actually don't read the law themselves, even of their own bill that they're sponsoring, that they so defer to the professional class, that they have an idea, either of their own from a trade association, that they give to you and they haven't even read their own bill? Is that conceivable or possible or even likely?
I would say likely. What you have to understand with legislation is that you're not writing it in a vacuum. In Colorado, for example, we've had statutes since prior to statehood We had a territorial legislature that Congress chartered to do things. So sometimes you create something brand new. Most of the time, creating whatever it is, whatever law you're going to create involves amending the existing law.
Sure.
All of that does become complex. So yes, I think it's likely there are legislators who never read anything that they
jump in, Professor Tootle.
Well, I've had precisely one idea in my life that I've ever wanted to be a state law. So if I were to pretend that I was a Colorado state legislator and I would come to you with, this is a real idea I have, something I think would be good. And that is, I would like it so that someone with a subject matter PhD could teach high school. One of the things that's remarkable to me is that you can have a PhD in history and not be qualified in any state to teach high school history. And I think it is bad. And the same goes for, you can have a PhD in biology and not teach high school biology. So if I came to you and I said, write this law for the state of Colorado, what would the process look like at that next stage? What would you do with that idea?
And some states have that law, by the way, I think, Professor. But Bart, go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, what I would do if you had brought me that request is I'd go look at the statutes and probably some administrative agency rules and regulations. Here in Colorado, we have a Department of Education that licenses teachers and all that kind of stuff. I would kind of see what's on the books now and figure out what I need to change to accomplish what your goal is, your policy goal. And to be honest, I did that for my entire career when I was there with the legislature here. And a lot of times legislators would bring their pet ideas that they had always had, like you were just describing, in, and they would say, hey, can this happen? Make this happen. And I would say, okay, here it is. Now, sometimes they wouldn't like the result because a lot of times public, there are all sorts of historical reasons why things are not the way they are. And that can happen.
A famous, well, probably not famous enough, but a few years back here in California, one legislator wanted to put a quota on how many Asians could go to the UC system. And you can imagine the outrage that erupted because frankly, the UC system today, the people who self-identify as being white are the smallest plurality in the UC system after Asians and Hispanics. And so, but the idea of actually having a quota targeted at Asians, as you can imagine, elicited howls of protest, and someone in the legislature put the brakes on it. But it got reported out of committee, so that's it. It went far. It went further than you would hope.
Now go ahead, John.
And answer your question, or go ahead and talk too, but follow up to Professor Tootle's comment. You're going to take, depending on the subject matter, but that was a good example, is a law that I've heard that kind of thing hundreds of times in 30 years. That would take you 2 hours or 2 weeks to research both former law and state regulation. And do you call people, or is it all book stuff? Talk to us about that process of how you determine what the law is and what needs to be changed.
That's a really good question. Actually, all of the above, everything you said. I had a duty, I don't know what it is in California, but I had a duty. I have the legislators I had attorney-client privilege with here in Colorado. We also had a statutory duty of confidentiality. So what I would do is I would research as much as I could in books and, and other things, and later on in my career on the internet. And I would find out as much as I could. If I needed more information, I would go back to that legislator and say, okay, here's what I found out. Now, it would be helpful if I also could talk to this person, and this person. Is that okay with you? for the most part, they would say yes. Sometimes they would say, no, I want this to be an absolute secret. And you'd say, okay, I will work with what I have. And then in terms of time.
Hold on. Let's delve into that first.
Okay.
The actual legislator, the sponsor of the bill, is your client, or the majority party is your client, or the state legislature is your client? Who is your loyalty to?
Well, in terms of professional lawyer ethics, my loyalty is actually to the institution. But the reality is, because of the statutes that govern the office I worked in, the Office of Legislative Legal Services, I also had a duty to each member when I was working on their legislation. Or
it was their bill. If they said no, don't talk to anybody, you're not talking to anybody until it's introduced.
Absolutely.
And you don't testify though, do you?
In committee, occasionally I did. To be honest, I would try to avoid that, and I would try to get the legislators to understand that was not a good idea, because I couldn't advocate for their policy. All I could do is explain why it's drafted the way it is and how it changes the law, which frankly, as you know, John, in a legislative committee, that's not really very helpful.
Right. But did you go and watch committee hearings, or did you listen to it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay,
Because
that's part of your duty.
You would get a feel for how people were reacting, what the likely amendments would be.
Were you sworn to uphold the Constitution in your office? I think you are as a lawyer, but is there a separate oath for members of the Legislative Legal Counsel and Legislative Legal Services, or no?
No, I was an employee. I was a state employee, but I was exempt from all the civil service rules. So
okay.
I was an at-will employee for all those years. I could have been kind of fired at a moment's notice.
Okay, but you didn't have to. How do you handle constitutional questions? Both with the legislature, you go, sorry, we can't do this, boss, he or she. Sorry, we can't do this, Madam Legislator. Or did that never happen in your career?
Oh, it happened all the time. I would have to, I would draft whatever they wanted, but it was my duty to explain to them what the potential obstacles could be. And those were always very interesting conversations. If, in fact, there's a legislator, the former state senator, he was actually a representative and a senator who's now deceased. So I guess we could talk about him. I had many very, very interesting conversations with him, because he always asked me to do things that violated the US Constitution. And I would have to sit there and explain to him, well, okay, here's your bill or your amendment or whatever it is. Now, they're going to ask you about this, this, and this. And there are US Supreme Court cases and federal laws that prohibit this. Are you aware of that? Because frankly, if you call on me to defend you, I'm not going to be able to. That was basically the message. I wouldn't put it that way. And they were very interesting conversations, because he'd always try to convince me that, well, this doesn't violate the federal Constitution. And I would always say to him, well, it actually does.
So, and so Bart, I'm thrilled that you brought that up, because it's a question I have of both of you. Who determines, and I know there's a book theory, and there's a legal answer, and then there's a kind of a social answer. Who determines what's constitutional or not? Professor Tootle, you go first. Who when the former president accuses the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of treason, well, who determines? Does the former president declare that it's treason, or does the current chief of staff say, no, it's not? I mean, and then who determines what's constitutional or not? And we don't have to use my example. I'm just saying it's a big picture, real world issue. Everybody says it's constitutional or it's unconstitutional. Who determines that in our process?
Well, there's just existing case law and existing statutes that are in effect. And if there's something where you strongly believe that this is an abuse, or that the current interpretation is wrong, well, then you have to appeal. But until you win the existing practice, the existing law, the existing statutes, the existing interpretation, that's what you go by. So, and
But
so
practically, who determines?
I mean, it's most of the stuff that people, Bart should probably answer this, but most of the stuff that people want to do is so blatantly obvious that it's not, you don't need to, these aren't hard questions. Most of the laws that people want to break are pretty well settled issues. So
Okay, let's leave it at that because I'm going to counterpoint that and see if you can just humiliate me. Bart, do you have an answer to that before I argue with you both?
Actually, I do have an answer to that.
Okay.
You know, in our constitutional system at the federal level and at the state levels, we have three branches of government. That's the way the founders set it up. The three branches are actually co-equal, except the courts kind of have the ultimate trump card, no pun intended, on what is considered constitutional or not constitutional. But within each of the branches at any given time, in the case of the legislature, the two houses, the House and the Senate, you know, we do have one state in the country that has a unicameral legislature, Nebraska, but those houses get to determine what they think is constitutional for them to do. If a court invalidates that, well, then it's not constitutional. You know, and rather interestingly, the only branch of government that doesn't have the power to actually enforce its judgment of what is constitutional is the court system, because they don't have an army.
They have no army.
The legislature and the executive do.
But to both of you, doesn't it get much more complex than you both just alluded to? I mean, somebody needs to determine whether they sit on the front of the bus or the back of the bus. I mean, an individual citizen determines what's right and constitutional, correct?
Well, I think, yes, and I would just say that I want to agree with Bart more than he agrees with himself, because we're so used to describing the three branches of government as being co-equal, but as Bart just pointed out, their state legislatures have and Congress are in many ways set up to be the prime movers, and the other branches are really checks on each other. So it's not so much that they are co-equal in a sense. The legislative assemblies, the Congress, and then your state legislatures.
You're talking Article 1 powers were written there very intentionally as number one powers.
Yeah. So in a way, let me agree with the second thing Bart said, which is the legislature can act, and then other places can put a check on that. But what Bart can do is he can tell this person, listen, this is going to get struck down. You know, we can do this for now, but it's going to get struck. You know, and you can sort of see how the lawsuits will play out and say, if this is a stunt, fine, but this is how this is probably going to play out. From I think it was last week or 2 or 3 weeks ago, our discussion on abortion, you said the Texas new law regarding abortion is a stunt that's going to be overruled, not even in the courts, but the federal government. The supremacy clause of the federal government will probably say, no, that ain't going to happen. And then the courts will stamp approval on that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's an example that somebody wrote that law. And Bart, your equivalent in Texas, that another branch will determine that's going to be unconstitutional. But to my point, you still have to have a citizen who says, I agree, that's unconstitutional, and I'm suing. I mean, there's got to be, and in a way, we all get to determine what's constitutional until some higher authority proves us wrong. Do you agree with that or not, both of you? In a sense, you know, I think I'm going to agree with you even more than, and that is that we have this opinion that somehow that the Supreme Court is the only group of people in America who are supposed to defend the Constitution. No, actually, Congress is supposed to be making these determinations. The state legislatures, everyone is supposed to be defending the Constitution. It isn't supposed to be just left up to the Supreme Court to defend the Constitution.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I totally agree with that. You know, and I think with another thing you have to look at that I found very interesting with the legislature is that the reality is, even though I would not go out and talk to people about legislation, for one reason or another, in a legislative process, there are very few actual secrets that people have. There's this big illusion out there that, oh, the Speaker of the House, or in Colorado, we have a President of the Senate and all that stuff. These people are keeping all these secrets and everything. The reality is they're not, because in order to pass legislation, you need to get a majority vote, usually, sometimes even a 2/3 vote or something like that. In order to get those votes, what do you need to do? You need to talk to your colleagues to try to get them to vote yes, if you want them to vote yes or vote no, as the case may be. So a lot of times things that are unconstitutional, in my role, I got a lot of help, because usually the legislator who had requested the thing that was unconstitutional would be trying to work with his or her members to try to get them to vote for it. Well, at some point, the other members begin to question what's going on.
Right.
They kind of say, well, gosh, why is that? You know, why can we do this? Have they told you this is okay to do? And the guy will have to admit, no, not really. And you start getting this pushback before things even move forward. So
would you, I'm going to think about how to word this in a way that you can answer it and still be fair to your former colleagues, but would you ever find that your job was easier if the state representatives were smarter or better human beings? Yeah.
You know, for most of my time that I was there, I have to say most of the people there acted in good faith. There were some that were a little disingenuous in terms of what they were trying to do. But for the most part, you had people who generally wanted to do the right thing. They were coming from different angles, depending upon whether they were conservative or liberal or somewhere in the middle. Some of them I wouldn't even classify as conservative or liberal. Some of them just wanted the government to work right. And they didn't say much. They would count votes and make sure they had a majority for what they wanted, but they weren't really ideological.
Yeah.
I think recently we have seen a lot of that because of what's going on at the federal level, where you really do have significant dysfunction in the US Congress, kind of in the House and the Senate, you know, and it's very difficult when you see that. You know, yeah, there were times where I had to have some uncomfortable conversations that I would have preferred not to have with legislators. And I guess if they were smarter, or whatever that means, yeah, it would have been easier. In some ways, though, the smarter members were harder to work with, because I couldn't just tell them, oh, this is going to be unconstitutional, don't do it.
Yeah.
I had to actually explain to them why it was unconstitutional. And, you know, and you would get that from all angles. So
let me, if I can, just have a follow-up here. I found that one of the things I would say to people a lot up until 5 years ago was I said that being actually involved in politics made me less cynical about politics, because I realized how often the people I was working with were good, high character, civic-minded people who were often frustrated by the political realities, but were trying to do the right thing.
Across the philosophical spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that changed for me about 5 or 6 years ago was I started seeing more people who were not good people, who were involved in politics, and that their bad behavior was getting rewarded. And that's one of the reasons why I took a step back from a lot of that, because I didn't want to be involved in it. But I wonder, you know, how long, I mean, if you noted a trend, or if you got out before it got bad.
That's a really good question. I think yeah, I'm still in contact with a lot of people I used to work with down there because it's great to be able to continue to have that connection. I think it has gotten harder to do what I used to do. I think a number of things that used to get dealt with through the political hierarchy of the legislature, you know, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the majority and minority leaders, a lot of those things have become much more public in terms of their disagreement and things of that nature. And John, you'll know what I'm talking about. Things like sexual harassment and just general harassment in the workplace at the Capitol here became a very public issue about 2.5, 3 years ago now. In fact, they actually expelled one legislator over that issue. Those types of issues have become much more difficult. And yeah, I did notice a trend, and it was probably because I was getting older, but the younger members were much more difficult to deal with because the focus that they had was on things that, well, from my perspective, was not particularly helpful to them in the legislative process. You know, they're concerned about tweeting properly and things of that nature, which are great for the 50 people who are reading their Twitter account every day. But if you actually want to pass a bill, there's certain things you got to do it. And you have to know how the process works. You've got to know who to talk to. I mean, the most frustrating thing I ever ran into was working for legislators who were very smart. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, but they refused to talk to their colleagues about what they were trying to do. So by the time they talked to their colleagues about it, they were already dead in the water because some interest group had already read the bill and decided they wanted to kill this bill. So no matter what colleague this member would talk to, there was no chance for the bill to go anywhere. Because the legislators just was like, look, I've already talked to lobbyist X about this and we can't do that, you know, but they could have done some version of it had that legislator actually knocked on their neighbor's door right next door to them and talked to them and got an ally for it. But
So
they just refused to do that stuff.
Does Colorado have term limits for their state legislators?
Yep, absolutely. And that's contributed to a lot of, you know, the perceived wildness of our current process here, which I don't think is that much more wild than when I worked with. But
actually, Colorado is one of the founders nationwide of term limits. It came from a very smart business guy, Terry Considine. National term limits movements came out of Colorado.
And one of the things that it has had the result of in California, and I was wondering if this is true in Colorado, but lobbyists become more important because the lobbyists are there longer and have the relationships and so it doesn't, it's funny because people assume that the power goes away, but it doesn't go away. It just shifts from elected members to lobbyists.
To former elected members who are now lobbyists.
Right. And so I'm not a fan of term limits for that, for that reason. I think I'd rather have powerful politicians who are able to control their members and have long-standing relationships with other politicians rather than unelected lobbyists.
So Bart, if you remember back to the Bev Bledsoe days, Speaker Bledsoe and Pat Grant and Norma Anderson and Dottie Wong, Senator Dottie Wong, I mean, those people were crazy powerful. And some were, I think, just housewives, and others were ranchers, and some were lawyers. But I mean, before term limits, they stayed there for 5 or 10 or 15 years, and they ran the entire legislature. They were, Professor Tootle's point, they were God and legislators. And that has some weaknesses too, if they're not benevolent. But can you talk about that evolution?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I first started in my job, there had been legislators who had been there since the early 1960s.
The immense of the world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And we had a guy, Jerry Copel, you know, who had been there kind of since the beginning of time, at least you know, when I was there, you know, and these were people. The big change I encountered over my career was that term limits created a situation where, when I first started, the legislators would tell me how the process worked. And these were people, sometimes they were lawyers, sometimes they weren't. It didn't matter. Colorado is a little different from California. Most of the legislators here are not lawyers. Yeah, in California and New York and some of these bigger states, a lot of them are. Here in Colorado, there's always a very small number of them, but the legislators would basically explain the process to me. They would say, okay, we want you to write this bill. Now, here's how we're gonna pass it. We're going to assign it to this committee. We're going to get that committee to amend it in this way. We're going to send it to another committee because we want more legislators to actually understand the bill before we get it to the floor. And then once we get it to the floor, here's what we're going to do with debate. And I would kind of soak all this up because I thought it was really cool. I'm just a geek, but it was totally cool. And Bev Bledsoe, it's interesting. John was mentioning names of people. We had a speaker here who had been speaker. God, he was getting to the end of his career when I started, but he had become speaker, I think, in the mid 1970s. And he had been a legislator for many, many years before that. He was a rancher. And I'll never forget the first time in my office, excuse me, I had to do a resolution for him. And I thought to myself, my God, I've only been here for like 6 months and I'm going to write a resolution for the Speaker of the House. And all of a sudden my phone rings, in my office, and, it's so the Speaker of the House is on the phone for you. And I'm like, really? Okay, what do I do with that? Well, he gets on the phone with me and he says, Bart, this is Bev. And his name was Carl Beverly Bledsoe. And he went by Bev. So he says, this is Bev. And I thought, Bev, well, hi, Mr. Speaker, how are you? Because this man was so powerful. He assigned the parking spots to the legislators. He assigned what offices they were in. If he didn't like you, he would take you out of your office and put you in the hallway. I mean, this guy, he would walk down the hall and the floor would shake, the marble floors. That's how powerful he was. But he was very kind to me, and he really did know the process. He didn't speak very much. He didn't tell you how he felt. What he did is he counted votes. He was very interesting. He knew exactly how a majority of the members of the House were going to vote on anything at any given time. And that was really his strength. And he knew if he had to pass something really important, he just knew, okay, I can get it done. And I've got enough votes right now today to do it. So I'm doing it today. And he would turn around to me and say, make sure it's right, because we're going to pass this now. And you'd say, okay, that's really cool. And when I first started, we also had a president of the Senate who had been there many years. John, you probably remember Ted Strickland.
Oh, sure. Who later became a commissioner.
That's right. He was a county commissioner, a colleague of yours. But these were people who just knew the legislative process so well. Now down there, people like me are telling them how to do it. Because to be honest, they don't know. They're not there long enough. It takes, I don't know, I used to say that it took about 4 to 6 years for a legislator to really understand how to do things correctly. And even the ones who would go through that kind of period of time, they still wouldn't get it for one reason or another. I mean, there was a legislator who I had a lot of respect for, a fantastically smart individual. He was an economist and all kinds of stuff. For some reason, he just never got it for the whole time he was there. And it was a shame because he had great ideas. I mean, I remember one time I was working on a bill for him and he wanted me to talk to another very powerful member of the House at that time. John, you probably remember him. I shouldn't be using all these names, but this was a guy named Tony Gramscis who became a very powerful.
I know Senator Gramscis.
Yeah, Senator Gramscis. Well, he was a representative at that point. And I remember going to him because this other member had said, hey, get Representative Gramscis to tell you he'll be a co-sponsor of this amendment. Well, I went to Gramscis and I said, hey, Representative X wants to know if you'll co-sponsor this. And he just shook his head and laughed. And he looked at me and he said, I'll co-sponsor it, but the bill's going to lose. And I kind of looked at him and he knew I didn't really care about that. And he said, the bill's going to lose because that other guy who who asked you to talk to me, he's in charge of it. No one's going to do anything that he says. And the guy just never got it. He was there for probably 8 years, 9 years. He just never got how you had to pass legislation. And it's a common problem. I mean,
so Bart, take it up, and then Professor, you weigh in on this as well. Colorado's unique, I think unique, but you probably know. We have like 3 or 4, or maybe even 5 different, and I think many of them are constitutional, process stuff that makes it fair for everyone. 2 that come to mind are the Sunshine Law that says two or more legislators can't get together and talk policy without it being open and announced to the public. That doesn't apply to Congress, and I assume many other states. And the other one I really like is, and there's probably more, gavel, which is every single legislator gets to have a hearing on their bill. I mean, if they sponsor a bill and you write it for them, it's going to get a hearing. Now, it may get killed right off the bat, but the bottom line is at least we know about it as citizens, and there's at least a superficial debate on it. Can you talk about those 2 or others that might be helpful for Congress, or do all states have those? Can you just give some thoughts on that?
Sure, I can do that. And Professor Tootle probably knows some of this too. But, Colorado became a state in 1876. So our Constitution is modeled after a lot of other states that got admitted to the Union at the same time. One of a number of the features that were considered reforms from what Congress has got put into the Colorado Constitution. One of them is the single subject requirement that you were talking about. Here in Colorado, and I'm not sure if it's like this in California or not, our Constitution says that every bill has to have a single subject. So you can't actually pass bills like, here we'll contrast it, like the coronavirus relief legislation that Congress did. These bills were thousands of pages long, and you just can't physically do that in Colorado because you have to have a single subject. And when I was working at the legislature, we actually had a big fiscal package. We used to do these big fiscal bills that were hundreds of sections long, and they really weren't that long. They were maybe 200 pages or something. But we had a Supreme Court decision from our state Supreme Court one year that declared that bill unconstitutional because it had so much stuff in it, it didn't have a single subject. So you have to have a single subject, and bills here have to get 3 readings. You get first reading, which is introducing the bill. You get second reading, which is kind of debating it. Then you get third reading, which is final passage. In the US Congress, they take all of that and they collapse it down into whatever period of time they want to do it. So like, as an example, this morning I got on and I was looking at the continuing resolution that they passed yesterday. That bill was interesting because it got passed by the House back in, I don't know, mid-September, let's just say. It went over to the Senate. The Senate completely amended the bill, put an entire new bill in place of that bill that had already passed the US House. They sent it back to the US House. The US House Rules Committee had already passed, they call it a rule. They basically have to do a rule to debate any bill in the US House. They had already passed a rule saying, okay, when that bill comes back, we're going to deem that we can debate it anytime we want to. We're going to allocate an hour debate to it. And we are going to deem that the House has already passed the amendment that the Senate put on the bill.
Without any congressperson, a member of the House, any of the 435 people actually reading it or voting on it.
Exactly. And that's the way they passed it. So Colorado, you just can't physically do that because the shortest period of time to pass legislation here that you can do it in is 3 days. You have to have first reading where you introduce it. You can do first reading and second reading on the same day. So usually what they'll do is if they really want to pass something fast, they'll do first reading, second reading on the same day. They'll pass it on third reading on a different day. They'll send it to the other house. The other house can do first reading and second reading on that same day. And then they'll pass it on the following day. So you get 3 days, to actually have something become a law here. The US Congress can do that in about 20 minutes if they're actually really hauling. and we'll probably see them do that again on the debt, whatever you call it, the debt limit increase that they'll pass here in a couple of weeks. That'll happen somehow by hook or by crook. But yeah, in Colorado, that's.
So you like sunshine and gavel and single subject, and there probably are some others. Is there anything you hate in Colorado? Do you think like, hey, now that I'm out, I can really speak the truth, and we should do blank? Professor Tootle gave you one example. Is there anything that you would pass if you decided to run for the legislature now?
I got to say, this is going to sound kind of milquetoast or something, but I think our process itself here is pretty good. I can't really think of any reforms that I would make, because actually when they do it right, it's actually pretty smooth. I do think there are times here, actually the one thing I would change, to be very honest, and I know this would be totally unpopular. The other thing we have in our Constitution here that is not in a lot of other state constitutions is we have what is called a 120-day legislative session. Basically, you get 120 calendar days, and there's an exception to that, but I'm not.
You'd go to Wyoming and meet every other year.
Right, in Wyoming, they meet every other year. I don't think that serves a very good purpose, to be really honest, because I think a lot of times people don't understand that legislation, they'll get upset because, oh my God, this is passing really fast. Well, the reality is the legislators have been talking about it for 2 years. They tried to do it the year before, they couldn't get it done. Now they're talking about it again. It's like, yeah, you just became aware of it because you were watching the news, the night before. But the reality is it's happening really fast. I think you would get more public debate on things if they had more time.
Okay.
The problem here is they introduce 1,000 bills and they can't physically have hearings that go very long on all of these bills. You'd never get that done.
You have confidence in the system. You like our system.
I do, actually.
Okay, Professor Tootle, I've got one big question. We're almost out of time. I want to see if Jason has anything, but the big question is, do you like our system? Both federally and in California or in Colorado, which you're familiar with, or other states, does our system work, or is it fundamentally flawed? And the reason I ask that of you is so many of our mutual friends hate our system. They think we're going to civil war. They think politicians are corrupt. They think the system's corrupt. They don't like it. I'm not sure they understand it, but they just are really almost violently angry at our system across the political spectrum. And that's the reason I wanted to do this show. And so we should all talk about that for a brief minute or two. Is our system work or not? Is it horribly flawed?
Well, I guess but those two things aren't mutually exclusive, because I would say it's not fundamentally flawed, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that large reforms wouldn't improve it. So I think generally speaking, our system now has, I would do away with term limits, for instance. I think some of the sunshine laws are counterproductive because it leads to grandstanding and doesn't allow for real debate to take place. I would undo a lot of campaign finance laws because the parties are too powerful, and and lobbyists are too powerful because of campaign finance and because of term limits. I would get rid of initiative, referendum, and recall for the same reason.
Interesting. I like those. We'll do a show on that. I actually like those, but
I would.
I don't like recall.
But just in general, I feel like the system has become too small d democratic, and while at the same time preventing politics from taking place by regulating it too heavily. The other thing I think that is because it is so heavily regulated, it becomes expensive just in terms of compliance. It's the barrier to entry into politics is too expensive. So because of regulatory compliance. So I mean, there are a lot of things at the margins, but then if you ask the question, is the system fundamentally flawed? Then no, but no, of course not. Yeah, it's still a representative form of government that has a rule of law and peaceful negotiations between parties. And those are the fundamentals of the system, and that's not flawed. But that doesn't mean that there aren't, reforms that I would advocate for.
Awesome. Huge, complex issue that you did in brevity. Bart, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would. The thing I would add is I think the big thing that has changed for the worse in our political system, and I think it's because we don't know how to handle it. Fundraising for politicians, you used to be relying on big donors. And I think because of that, there was actually a disincentive to make a fool of yourself as a politician to get your points across, because you knew that, oh my God, if I offended these people, they wouldn't give me money. Now we have taken that. I guess the good side is we've taken that now and we've spread it out across all the small people. I get emails all day long from, donate to this campaign committee and donate to that campaign committee, even though I'm an independent. I'm unaffiliated. And we've made it now so that everybody can donate little sums of money and they can raise zillions of dollars. The problem is there's no disincentive to not be an idiot as a politician, because as long as your money keeps rolling in over the internet, you don't really care, because it's being reinforced. Oh, I made a fool of myself, but I'm just going to do it again because I raised X number of dollars that day.
Well, and you're not actually making a fool of yourself. You're just sticking it to somebody, and some people like you to stick it to somebody, even if it's silly. You're still sticking it to somebody, so they'll give you money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that's a real issue today.
I agree 1,000%. That is exactly the kind of thing I was just describing. Is we were so worried about backroom deals and big money donors that we forget that there's a cost, there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is that all of these things, we're just shifting the incentives. We're weakening the political parties. We're saying that stunts and celebrities and bad policies and bad legislatures and not getting anything done is financially rewarded and gives you a sense of that you can be independent. Because if you're an idiot, you just have to find idiots all over the country who agree with you. They don't even have to live in your district. So you just have to be, find your constituency and fundraise from them and be outrageous.
Yeah, and I think that's become a real problem, because it's making it so that the processes that should be deliberative are actually becoming really dysfunctional.
Okay, let's have another conversation on that another day.
Yeah.
Campaign finance reform and funding of the political cycles, and we can go all the way back to the common sense and Thomas Paine and and how things were funded. So that's another good topic. I know we're out of time. Jason, you took yourself off mic. Generally, you type, but I want to give you, as always, a chance to ask a question briefly. Jason? At some point, we're going to get you. Okay. Professor Tootle, well, first...
Hey, could I say something, John?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think lobbyists is a topic that we should cover in the future. Not only do I not understand the process, but it sounds, based on what you're saying, as if they have much more power in our current system than they used to have.
A ton more. Yeah,
I'd love
all three of us have expertise on that, so we should talk about that. Okay, good. Thank you, Tony. Anything else, Jason? No. Hey, Bart, do you mind giving a conclusion of what?
We lost your audio there, John, but I'll go ahead and jump in. Yeah, I'm honored that you all thought it would be interesting to talk to me about these issues. I will say that, this has been very enjoyable, and I hope I haven't bored everybody to death. I mean, that's generally what I do, which is difficult. But I think, I felt honored to be able to do what I did for all the years that I did it. When I first started doing it, I thought, oh my God, I'll do this for a year or two and then I'll do something else. But I ended up finding it so rewarding because you actually, I mean, I could do more damage to the law in 10 minutes than most lawyers can do in 40 years of practicing law. Because they would come to me and say, oh, you know, can we change this to this? And I'd kind of say, oh my God, it's been that way for 200 years, but okay, you know, you're the legislators and you have the right to change this if you want to, and the governor will sign it. So, you know, that part of what I used to do was fascinating. And I guess I was the ultimate insider in a way, because people, you know, lobbyists would talk to me, but it was only with the permission of a legislator. So yeah, they would talk to me outside of that context too, because they'd want me to, you know, be their friends and stuff. But, you know, it was an interesting, it was a fascinating career to have for as many years as I did, because you really are on the cutting edge of what's going on. And there's really no better way to do that other than being an elected official. But I even knew things that some of the elected officials didn't know.
So Bart, you have been in two of the branches of government. You were both in the executive, but then you ran for city council and served in office. So that was in the legislative at the local level. I guess the only thing remaining in your career is to be appointed as a judge.
Yeah, and if truth be known, I actually, I have applied for judgeships in the past. But for whatever reason, I don't have the right stuff for that, I guess.
Well, maybe this show will be the tipping point, because you're one of more thoughtful people I've ever met. So thank you for doing this show with Professor Tootle and I. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Professor Tootle, you have the last word.
I just wanted to agree with something that Tony said in the comments, which is that Bart's the kind of person who gives us faith in the process. You know, knowing that there are people like him out there doing the hard work day in, day out. Like, every now and then we need to get reminded of all the good people who make our society function by doing the quiet, you know, normal functioning, you know, hard work of democracy. And so I guess I'll probably speak for Tony here and just say thank you.
Brilliant. Excellent.
Thank you, everybody.
Excellent conversation today, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. Hopefully people will listen when they're really angry at something. Hopefully we can give them some context on how to be more effective in their anger. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Adios. Thank you, Bart.
See you in 2 weeks. We're taking next Friday off. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Excellent.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Going to the
Thanks,
dentist.
Bart. Bye.
See you.
And we're just going to hang up this show.
Right on.
Okay. Thanks, guys.